February 12th, 1941. The snow outside the Willow Run bomber plant came down so hard you couldn't see the fence line. Inside, Charles Sorensen looked at the half-built bomber fuselage and saw a disaster unfolding. The phone had rung at 6:30 a.m. A supervisor from the night shift voiced tight. "Mr. Sorensen, you need to see this." Now, standing in the flickering fluorescent light, Sorensen saw it too. The center wing section sat crooked on its jig. The rivet holes didn't line up. 3,000 miles away, Hitler's armies were moving through North Africa. In Washington, generals were waiting for bombers. But here, in America's biggest factory, they couldn't even get the pieces to fit. Sorensen walked around the fuselage, his boots echoing on the concrete. He was 60 years old, with hands like slabs of oak from 40 years in the foundry. They called him Cast Iron Charlie. He had built Model Ts by the million. He had put the world on wheels. Now, Henry Ford had pulled him aside and said, "Do for planes what you did for cars. Make one every hour," Ford had said. The War Department needed 10,000 B-24 Liberators. The old way would take 10 years. They didn't have 10 years. But this wasn't a car. A B-24 had 1,550,000 parts. It weighed 36,000 pounds. The tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch, not the sloppy play of automotive mass production. The aviation people said you couldn't build a plane on a line. Planes were craft. Each one was special. You built them in place, like ships, and you prayed they flew. Sorensen had listened to them. He'd hired their engineers. He'd let them run the line their way. And now, this. 12 weeks of work, and the bomber was a paperweight. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pack of Camels. His fingers shook slightly as he lit one. The smoke curled up into the high rafters. He thought about the meeting last week in Washington. The colonel from the Army Air Forces had leaned across the table. "Mr. Sorensen, we're losing the war while your factory builds one bomber a week. Do you understand that?" The colonel's voice had been quiet. That was worse than shouting. Ford wanted him to fix it. The government wanted him to fix it. But the goddamn parts wouldn't fit. Sorensen walked over to the engineering table and looked at the blueprints. They were beautiful, precise, perfect, and completely useless on a factory floor where you had to build something fast and build it right. He thought about the assembly line at Highland Park, where he had taken the Model T and broken it down into 84 distinct steps. Each man did one thing. Each part came to the worker. The chassis moved on chains. The line never stopped. You couldn't do that with a plane. Everyone said so. Sorensen stubbed his cigarette out on the concrete and lit another. The snow kept falling outside. Inside, the half-built bomber sat like a corpse. He looked at the blueprint. He looked at the bomber. He looked at the empty factory floor, designed to hold a mile-long assembly line that didn't exist yet. Then, he did something that would have gotten him arrested in peacetime. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a set of automotive production schematics. They were old, creased, covered in his own pencil marks from 1913. The first moving assembly line, the one that changed everything. He laid the car schematics next to the bomber blueprints. The workers were watching him now, silent in the cold. Sorensen's fingers traced the lines. Car, bomber, car, bomber. His mind was moving faster than his hands could follow. The aviation engineers would call it heresy. The government would call it risky. Ford would call it genius. But first, Sorensen needed to make a phone call that would sound like treason to anyone listening. He walked to the office, snow melting off his shoes onto the tile floor. The phone was black, heavy. He dialed a number from memory. It rang twice. "Mr. Ford," Sorensen said, "I need to show you something, and you're not going to like it." The line clicked dead before Ford said a word. That was his way. He'd either show up or he wouldn't. He showed up at 7:45 a.m. Ford walked through the snow in an old overcoat, no hat, his thin white hair catching the wind. He was 77 years old, and he moved like a man who had nowhere to be and everywhere to go. He didn't look at Sorensen when he entered. He went straight to the half-built bomber and stood there for a full minute, just looking. His hands stayed in his pockets. He didn't say anything. The snow was still falling outside. Inside, the factory was so quiet you could hear the hiss of the overhead lights. Finally, Ford turned to Sorensen. "Show me." Sorensen spread the automotive schematics across the drafting table. The paper crackled. He laid the bomber blueprints beside them. "We build a car in 84 steps," he said. His voice sounded rough in the silence. Each worker does one thing. The chassis moves, the parts come to him, the line never stops. Ford looked at the car schematics. He had drawn some of these himself 40 years ago. He knew every line. "We're building this bomber like a ship," Sorensen continued, "like it's one piece, like it's special. But it's not special. It's a machine. It has wings instead of wheels. It has bombs instead of passengers. But it's still a machine." He tapped the bomber blueprint. 1.5 million parts, but you can break it down. The fuselage, the wings, the tail assembly, the bomb bay. You build each one separate, on its own line, like we're building engines or transmissions. Then you bring them together at the end, like a final assembly. Ford's eyes moved from the paper to the bomber.
He walked around it again. Sorensen could see the old man's mind working. He wasn't thinking about planes. He was thinking about the Model T, about the time they'd built a car in 93 minutes, about the way you could take something complex and make it simple by cutting it into pieces. "It won't fly," a voice said. They both turned. Ed Martin, the chief aviation engineer, stood in the doorway. He was young, 32, with a degree from MIT and a look on his face like he just smelled something rotten. Behind him were half a dozen other engineers, the ones Sorensen had hired away from Boeing and Consolidated, the ones who knew aircraft. "Mr. Ford," Martin said, trying to keep his voice level, "you can't build a bomber like a car. The tolerances are too tight. The stress factors are too complex. Every rivet has to be perfect. You can't just slap it together on a line and expect it to fly at 20,000 feet with a full bomb load." Ford looked at him. "Why not?" Martin opened his mouth, then closed it. Because it's never been done." Ford turned back to Sorensen. "How many pieces?" 51 major subassemblies, Sorensen said. He'd been up all night breaking it down. Each one built on its own line, each one tested before it moves to final assembly. The fuselage comes in 4 sections. The wing center section is 1. The outer wings are 2 more. We build each piece like it's a car door or a fender. Then we marry them at the end. "You'll have tolerance creep," Martin said. He was walking toward them now, his hands moving as he talked. "Little errors compound. By the time you put the sections together, the holes won't line up. The stress will be wrong. The damn thing will shake itself apart in flight." Sorensen reached into his coat and pulled out another cigarette. "Then we control the tolerances. We build jigs so precise that every subassembly is identical to the 1,000th of an inch. We don't let the errors creep. We stop them before they start." "The jigs alone will take 6 months to design," Martin said. "We don't have 6 months." "Then you'll kill aircrew." The words hung in the air. Sorensen looked at the bomber. He thought about the boys who would fly these things, the ones who were still in high school right now, learning to shave, the ones who would climb into these aluminum tubes and go to Germany and maybe not come back. He thought about the colonel in Washington. "We're losing the war while your factory builds 1 bomber a week." Ford walked over to the engineering table. He looked at the schematics. He looked at Sorensen. Then he did something no one expected. He picked up a pencil and started drawing. It was a rough sketch, a line down the center of the factory, little boxes along the line. Each box was a station. Each station had a name: fuselage section A, wing center section, tail group, bomb bay doors. It looked exactly like the assembly line for a Model A, except each box was a bomber part. He drew for 3 minutes. No one spoke. The only sound was the pencil scratching on paper and the hiss of the lights. He pushed the paper to Sorensen. "Show me the jigs," he said. Martin started to protest. Ford looked at him. The young engineer stopped. Ford had a way of looking at people that made them feel like they'd just said something embarrassing. "We're not building cars," Ford said. His voice was quiet. "We're building something more important, but we're building it the same way, because it works." He turned to walk out. At the door, he paused. "You have 1 month," he said. "Not 6, 1. Then he was gone, disappearing into the snow. Sorensen looked at the sketch. The engineers looked at Sorensen. Martin's face had gone pale. "You're going to kill people," Martin said. "Maybe," Sorensen said, "but if we don't try, we're going to lose the war." He walked back to the bomber, the crooked wing section, the misaligned rivet holes, the whole damn mess. He turned to the workers who had been watching. "Take it apart," he said. "What?" one of them asked. "Take it apart. We're starting over."
As the workers began cutting the bomber apart with torches, Sorensen walked to the office and picked up the phone again. This time he called Detroit. He needed the best tool and die men in the city, the ones who could build jigs that never wavered, the ones who thought in thousandths of an inch. It was 9:15 a.m. Outside, the snow had stopped. Inside, they were about to try something that had never been done. The phone rang 8 times before someone picked up. "Detroit Tool and Die," a voice said. It was thick with sleep. "I need your 12 best men," Sorensen said, "today." "Who is this?" "Charles Sorensen, Willow Run." The voice on the other end woke up fast. "Mr. Sorensen, yes sir, what time?" 6 a.m. "Tell them to bring their micrometers and their nerve." He hung up and looked out the office window. The sun was breaking through the clouds, turning the snow to slush. A mile away, the factory floor stretched empty and waiting. It had been built to produce 4-engine bombers, but right now, it couldn't build one. At 5:30 the next morning, Sorensen was back at the plant. He'd slept 4 hours on a cot in the office. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes were red, he was drinking black coffee from a tin cup that burned his hand. The tool and die men started arriving at 5:45. They were old men, most of them, men who had built the dies for the Model T, for the Model A, for the V8. Their hands were steady, their eyes were narrow. They didn't talk much. They just stood on the factory floor and waited. Sorensen showed them the blueprint. The bomber exploded into 51 pieces. Each piece had to be built on its own line. Each line needed a master jig, a steel cage so precise that every part that came out of it would be identical to the one before. "Mr. Martin here says it can't be done," Sorensen said. He gestured to the young engineer, who had shown up at 5 a.m. to watch this madman's parade. The oldest tool and die man, a guy named Frank Clan, looked at Martin. Then he looked at the blueprint. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his shirt pocket and put them on. He studied the paper for a long minute. "Why not?" Clan asked. "The tolerances," Martin said. He was trying to be patient. "Aircraft-grade aluminum expands and contracts. Rivet patterns have to be perfect. Stress distribution is critical. If one wing is even a 64th of an inch different from the other, the plane will fly crooked or not at all." Clan looked at the blueprint again. Then he looked at the empty factory floor. "We built the Model T body dies to a tolerance of 2/1000ths of an inch," he said. "That was in 1915. This is 1941. We have better steel now, better measuring tools, better everything." He folded the blueprint and tucked it under his arm. "You're not asking us to do something harder than a car, Mr. Sorensen. You're asking us to do the same thing, just bigger. We'll need 3 weeks. "You have 10 days, Clan smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. "Then we'll need more coffee." The next 10 days were a blur of sparks and steel. The tool and die men worked in teams, 3 shifts around the clock. They built jigs for the fuselage nose section, jigs for the bomb bay doors, jigs for the wing spars. Each jig was a cage of steel tubing and clamps that held the aluminum parts in place while workers drilled and riveted. Martin watched them work. At first, he was just checking their work, looking for the mistake that would prove him right. But by the 3rd day, he was asking questions. By the 5th, he was sketching modifications. By the 7th, he was working alongside Clan, showing them where the stress points were, where the rivet lines had to be perfect, where a 64th of an inch really mattered. On the 8th day, Sorensen got a telegram from Washington. It had 3 words: "Where are they?" He didn't answer. On the 9th day, they ran the first test. The nose section of a fuselage, built in a jig that looked like a steel rib cage. It took 47 minutes from start to finish. The aviation inspectors measured every rivet. They checked the alignment with lasers, they x-rayed the welds. It was perfect. Martin looked at the finished section. Then he looked at Clan. The old tool and die man was drinking coffee from the same tin cup Sorensen had used. His hands were shaking slightly from exhaustion. "It might work," Martin said. It was the first time he'd said those words. Clan just nodded. "It's just a bigger car, son." On the 10th day, Henry Ford came back. He didn't call ahead. He just walked onto the factory floor at 6 a.m., the same way he'd walked out 10 days before. The jigs were in place now, 51 steel cages, each one a station on a line that stretched 3/4 of a mile. Workers were already at the first station, loading aluminum sheet into the nose section jig. Ford walked the entire line. He didn't say anything. He just looked. At the end, where the final assembly would happen, he stopped and turned to Sorensen. "How long for one bomber?" he asked. 1 hour, Sorensen said. "When we get it right." Ford looked at the line, he looked at the workers, he looked at the jigs. Then he did something that made Sorensen's breath catch. He smiled. "Start it," Ford said. But before Sorensen could give the order, another man walked onto the factory floor. A colonel from the Army Air Forces, the same one who had been in Washington. He had a second man with him, a civilian in a dark suit. The civilian was carrying a briefcase. The colonel looked at the line. He looked at the jigs. He looked at Sorensen. "The Secretary of War wants to see a test flight," the colonel said. "Tomorrow," Sorensen said. "We haven't built a whole plane yet." "Then you'd better start," the colonel said, "because if that bomber doesn't fly by noon tomorrow, they're shutting this plant down, and they're sending you home." The civilian in the dark suit opened his briefcase. He pulled out a stopwatch. The colonel's car disappeared down the access road. The wind off the runway picked up, cold and steady. Sorensen stood alone with the bomber, his cigarette burned down to his knuckles. Martin walked up behind him. He'd stopped crying, but his voice was still raw. What did he mean by the book? Sorensen dropped the cigarette butt and crushed it under his boot. "He means the government wants to run the line. They can't. They don't know how. They don't have to know how. They just have to sign the checks." Sorensen walked back toward the factory. Martin followed. The bomber sat on the tarmac, engines cooling, ticking in the wind. The civilian with the stopwatch was taking photographs. He didn't look at them. Inside, the factory floor was quiet. The workers had gone home, most of them. A few pushed brooms. The jigs stood empty, their steel frames casting long shadows from the high windows. The line looked like a skeleton, waiting for flesh. Sorensen went to his office and poured another cup of coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. The phone rang. He looked at it for 3 rings before he picked up. "Willow Run," he said. "This is Washington," a voice said. It was a woman's voice, crisp and efficient. "The Secretary of War's office. Hold for the Secretary." Sorensen held. He looked at the wall calendar. March 1941. They'd been building jigs for 6 weeks. They'd built 1 bomber in 17 hours. And now the most powerful man in the War Department wanted to talk. The line clicked. "Mr. Sorensen." "Mr. Secretary," Sorensen said, "I saw the report. 17 hours, 1 bomber. That is impressive." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. I've got a problem. The British need bombers. Yesterday. The Russians need bombers. Yesterday. My own people need bombers. Yesterday. You're building 1 bomber. I'm not interested in 1 bomber." "I understand, sir." "Do you? Because my aviation advisors are telling me you can't build a bomber an hour. They say it's impossible. They say you'll kill crews. They say the tolerances won't hold." Sorensen didn't answer. He just held the phone. The secretary went on. "But my production advisors are telling me something else. They're telling me that if you can build a bomber in 17 hours, you can build 2 a day, maybe 3. And if you can build 3 a day, you can win the war." "We can build 4 a day," Sorensen said, "once the line is running." The line was quiet. Sorensen could hear the secretary breathing. 4 a day, the secretary said. "That's 1 every 6 hours, not 1 an hour." "Not yet," Sorensen said. "The line has to learn. The workers have to learn. Right now, they're thinking. When they stop thinking, they start building." "I want to see it," the secretary said. 1 week from today, I want to see a bomber roll off that line every 6 hours for a full day, 4 bombers. If you can do that, I'll give you your 1 an hour target. If you can't, we're taking over the plant. We'll run it the old way, 1 bomber a week." The phone went dead. Sorensen put the receiver down. He looked at Martin, who was standing in the doorway. 1 week, Sorensen said. 4 bombers, 1 every 6 hours. Martin let out a breath. "We just built 1 in 17 hours. 4 in 24 hours is—" "More coffee," Sorensen said. He walked past Martin and out onto the floor. He stood looking at the jigs. He thought about the line, about the workers, about the 17 hours they just pulled. He thought about the Model T line in 1913. The first day, they'd built 1 car. It took 12 hours. The second day, they built 2. By the end of the week, they built 1 every 90 minutes. By the end of the month, 1 every 24 minutes. The line learned. The workers learned. They stopped thinking about how to do it and just did it. But a bomber wasn't a car. A bomber was 36,000 pounds of aluminum and steel and hope. A bomber was a thing that young men flew to their deaths. A bomber had to be perfect. Or did it? Sorensen walked to the engineering table and pulled out the original consolidated aircraft blueprint, the one they'd been given when they won the contract. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was also the reason they'd built one bomber in 12 weeks. He looked at the rivet patterns, thousands of them, each one specified, each one critical. In a car, you used as many rivets as you needed to hold the fender on. In a plane, the blueprint told you exactly how many, exactly where. But what if the blueprint was wrong? Not wrong about the plane, wrong about how to build it. Sorensen took a pencil and started counting. Rivets per wing, rivets per fuselage section, rivets per tail. The numbers were enormous, astronomical. It would take a man with a rivet gun all day to do one wing section. And they had to build 4 bombers in one day. He called Martin over. "How many rivets in a wing?" Sorensen asked. Martin didn't need to look. 32,412. How many does it need? What do you mean? How many rivets does it actually need to hold together? Not what the blueprint says. What does physics say? Martin looked at him like he'd just asked how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. "The blueprint is the plane," Martin said. "You change the rivet count, you change the stress distribution. You change the stress distribution, you change the aerodynamics. You change the aerodynamics, you kill aircrew," Sorensen finished. "I know, but what if we're putting rivets in places that don't need them? What if we're building this thing like a ship with double rivets and triple redundancy because that's how Consolidated built them? What if we only put rivets where the stress is?" Martin started to object. Then he stopped. He looked at the blueprint. He looked at the jig. "In the automotive line," Sorensen said, "we use exactly the number of bolts needed. No more, no less. Because every bolt is time. Every bolt is money. And if you put a bolt where it doesn't need to be, you're wasting both." He tapped the blueprint. "What if we built this bomber like a car? What if we used exactly the number of rivets needed?" Martin was quiet for a long time. The factory floor was silent around them. "Show me the stress analysis," Sorensen said. "Show me where every rivet goes. Not where the blueprint says, where physics says." Martin took the blueprint. He walked away. He didn't say no. That night, Sorensen slept in the office again. He dreamed about rivets, thousands of them, falling from the sky like rain. The next morning at 6 a.m., Martin was waiting for him on the factory floor. He had circles drawn on the blueprint. Red circles, blue circles, green circles, thousands of circles. "Red are critical," Martin said. "Blue are important. Green are excess?" Sorensen asked.
Conservative, Martin said. The blueprint author was conservative. He added rivets where he wasn't sure, where he was afraid. How many green circles? 60% of the total. Sorensen looked at the blueprint. 60% fewer rivets. That meant 60% less time per wing, per fuselage, per bomber. "Will it fly?" he asked. Martin looked at the bomber they'd built yesterday, still sitting on the tarmac, still ticking in the wind. "I don't know," Martin said, "but if it doesn't, we won't find out until it's too late." Sorensen looked at the line. He thought about the Secretary of War. He thought about the Colonel. He thought about the boys who would fly these things. "Build a test section," he said. "One wing. No green rivets, just red and blue. We'll stress test it. If it holds, we build the bombers that way." "When?" "Today, right now." "And Martin?" "Yes." "If it breaks, you're fired." "If it breaks," Martin said, "we're all fired." He walked to the wing jig. The workers were already gathering, waiting for instructions. The line was ready. The question was whether they were building the future or a coffin. Sorensen went to the office and picked up the phone. He called Detroit again. He needed aluminum. He needed rivets. He needed everything. But most of all, he needed time. And time was the one thing the Secretary of War wasn't giving him. The phone in Detroit hadn't stopped ringing since yesterday. The aluminum supplier said 2 weeks. The rivet supplier said 10 days. Sorensen told them both they had until tomorrow. When they started to argue, he mentioned the Secretary of War. The timelines got shorter. On the factory floor, they built the test wing. Martin had 12 men on it, all of them riveters from the night shift who could work by feel. They used only the red and blue circles. The green ones stayed in their boxes. The wing grew as the day wore on, a skeleton of aluminum spars and ribs, then skinned over with thin metal sheets. Every rivet was inspected. Every seam was measured. It took 11 hours. The civilian from the secretary's office watched the whole thing. He stood near the jig with his briefcase and his stopwatch, saying nothing. His name was Harris.
He wrote things down on a small pad of paper. When Martin asked what he was writing, Harris just looked at him and kept writing. At 5 p.m., the wing was done. It looked wrong somehow, too clean, like a skeleton missing half its bones. The rivet pattern was sparse, almost delicate. Martin could see daylight through the gaps where green rivets should have been. At 5:30, they moved it to the stress test rig. This was a steel frame that bent the wing, twisted it, pulled it with hydraulic jacks that simulated the forces of flight. Every bomber wing went through this. Usually, they tested to 150% of maximum expected load. Martin set the machine for 175%. If they were going to break it, they would break it now. The workers cleared the area. Harris stayed right next to the rig, watching. Martin stood at the control panel, his hand on the lever. Sorensen stood behind him, smoking. "Ready?" Martin asked. His voice was tight. Sorensen nodded. Martin pulled the lever. The hydraulics hissed. The wing began to bend upward. The aluminum groaned. The rivets creaked. A workman off to the side crossed himself. The gauge climbed. 50% load. The wing bent more. A rivet head popped off and pinged against the concrete. Someone gasped. Martin flinched but held the lever. 75%. Another rivet went. Then another. The wing was making a sound like ice breaking on a pond. "Stop it," Harris said. He was backing away. "Keep going," Sorensen said. Martin's hand was shaking on the lever. The gauge hit 100%. The wing bent at a sharp angle now, almost 45 degrees. It should have snapped. It should have torn itself apart. But it held. 125%. The groaning got louder. More rivets popped. They flew like bullets. A worker ducked. 150%. The design limit. The wing was bent almost double. It looked impossible, like a bird with a broken back that somehow kept flying. "Stop," Martin said. "That's the spec." Sorensen stepped forward. He put his hand over Martin's and pushed the lever forward. 160, 170, 175. The wing held. For a full minute, it held. The hydraulics screamed. The aluminum shrieked. Then Sorensen released the lever. The pressure dropped. The wing sprang back, not quite straight, but close. It hadn't broken. It hadn't failed. Martin was staring at the gauge like it had lied to him. Harris had his notebook out. He was writing fast. "It's 1,000 pounds lighter," Martin said. His voice was hollow. "Without the green rivets, it's 1,000 pounds lighter." 1,000 pounds. That meant more bombs, more fuel, more range, or just a faster climb to altitude. Sorensen walked to the wing. He ran his hand along the skin. It was warm from the stress. He could feel the popped rivet holes, little dimples where the green rivets should have been. But the structure was solid. It was whole. "Build them like this," he said. "Mr. Sorensen, we start tomorrow. 4 bombers, 1 every 6 hours. No green rivets." Martin looked at the wing. He looked at Harris, who had stopped writing and was just watching them. "If one of these fails in flight," Martin said, "if one of these wings comes off over Germany—" "It won't," Sorensen said. "It just held at 175%. What's that tell you?" "It tells me we were overbuilding them before. It tells me the blueprint was wrong. It tells me," Sorensen said, "that we were building them scared, and we can't afford to be scared anymore." He walked away, toward the office. He needed to make another call, this one to Henry Ford. He needed to tell him they'd found the shortcut, not in the assembly line, but in the plane itself. But before he got to the phone, the floor manager ran up, a young guy named Collins, face flushed. "Mr. Sorensen," Collins said, breathing hard, "we got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The workers, the riveters, they heard about the test. They heard we're taking out rivets. And they're refusing to work. They say they won't build a bomber that's going to kill kids." Sorensen looked across the factory floor. The day shift was coming in. They were standing by the jigs, not working, just talking. Their voices were getting louder. In the middle of them stood Frank Clan, the old tool and die man. He had his arms crossed. He was shaking his head. "Get them in the cafeteria," Sorensen said. "All of them, right now." As Collins ran off, Sorensen looked at Martin. The young engineer was still touching the test wing, like he couldn't believe it was real. "You'd better be right," Sorensen said, "because if you're not, we're not just going to lose the plant, we're going to lose the war." The cafeteria smelled of boiled coffee and motor oil. 200 men and women sat at long wooden tables, still wearing their work clothes, leather aprons over flannel shirts. Frank Clan stood near the front, his arms crossed. The woman next to him, Betty something, held a lunch pile in her lap so tight her knuckles were white. Sorensen walked in and stood by the coffee urn. He poured himself a cup, more to have something to do with his hands than to drink. The room got quiet. These were his workers. They'd followed him from Highland Park, from the River Rouge plant. They'd built cars for 20 years. Now he was asking them to build death traps. "Who told you?" Sorensen asked. Someone in the back said, "Collins." The floor manager looked at his shoes. Sorensen nodded. "Then Collins told you we took 60% of the rivets out." No one moved. "And you think that means we're building junk that'll kill kids?" A man stood up. He was young, with a scar on his cheek from a press break. "My brother's in England. He's a tail gunner on a B-24. If we build something that falls apart—" "I know," Sorensen said. "I got a boy at Hickam Field, Hawaii." The room shifted. They hadn't known that. "So don't tell me about aircrew," Sorensen said. "Don't tell me about killing kids. I think about that every time I light a cigarette." He looked at Frank Clan. "You were on the Model A line, Frank. You remember when we switched from hand-hammered body panels to press-stamped?" Clan nodded. "Half the old-timers said the new panels would crack. They said the dies were too fast, the steel was too thin. They said we'd kill people when the bodies fell apart at 60 miles an hour." "I remember," Clan said. "Were they right?" Clan looked at the floor. "No." "Why not?" "Because we built the dies right. We built them tight. We tested them until they broke. Then we built them stronger." Sorensen walked to the center of the room. He set his coffee down. "That's what we did with the wing. We built it light, then we tried to break it. We bent it until it screamed. It held at 175% of design load." Betty spoke up. Her voice was quiet. "My husband's a pilot trainer. He says the B-24 is already too heavy. He says it can't climb with a full load." "That's right," Sorensen said. 1,000 pounds too heavy. 60% of rivets we don't need. That's 1,000 pounds of bombs we could carry, 1,000 pounds of fuel, or just 1,000 pounds less for those boys to lift off the runway while German fighters are shooting at them. He let that sit. Frank Clan uncrossed his arms. "You're telling us the old blueprint was wrong." "I'm telling you the old blueprint was scared. The man who drew it didn't know if his plane would fly, so he put in extra rivets everywhere, just in case." "And you know better?" "No," Sorensen said, "but I know we tested it, I know it held, and I know we have 4 days to build 4 bombers or they're shutting us down." The room murmured. They hadn't heard that part. 4 bombers, Sorensen said, 1 every 6 hours. And if we can't do it, the government takes over. They bring in their own engineers. They build them the old way, 1 bomber a week while Hitler takes Europe. He looked at the young man with the scar. "Your brother in England, how many missions has he flown?" 8, sir. "Out of how many before they send him home?" 25. "So he's got 17 more. At 1 bomber a week, we build 17 bombers before he goes home. At 4 a day, we build enough to give him a chance." The young man sat down. Sorensen walked to the door. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust the test. The wing didn't lie. The numbers didn't lie. And if we don't start building right now, the war is going to lie to us about who's going to win." He opened the door. Cold air from the factory floor came in. "I'm starting the line in 10 minutes, he said. "Anyone who wants to join me, get your tools. Anyone who doesn't, go home. No hard feelings. But decide now." He walked out. The door swung shut behind him. He stood in the hallway, listening. For 30 seconds, nothing. Then chair scraped. Boots hit the floor. Voices murmured. He couldn't tell if they were leaving or staying. The door opened. Frank Clan came out first. He looked at Sorensen. "We got conditions," he said.
"What conditions?" "Every rivet gets inspected, every single one, no exceptions. And that young engineer, Martin, he rides the line. He stops it if he sees something wrong. Done." "And Collins is fired?" "No, Collins stays. He made a mistake, but he was trying to protect you. That's the kind of man I need." Clan almost smiled. "Then let's build some bombers." They walked onto the factory floor together. The workers were already at their stations. Martin stood by the first jig, holding a clipboard, looking terrified. The aluminum sheets were loaded. The rivet guns were charged. The line was ready. Sorensen went to the office and picked up the phone. He called the secretary's office. "Mr. Sorensen," the woman said, "tell the secretary we'll be ready. 4 bombers, 1 every 6 hours, starting at midnight Sunday." "Midnight?" "Midnight," Sorensen said. "Tell him to bring his stopwatch." He hung up and looked at the clock on the wall. 4 days, 96 hours, 4 bombers.
Outside, the snow had started again. Inside, the line began to move. The first bombers started moving at 6 p.m. on Sunday. They decided not to wait for midnight. Sorensen figured if they were going to fail, they'd give themselves time to fail twice. At Station 1, 2 men loaded the nose section into the jig. The aluminum was still warm from the shear press. By Station 3, the bombardier's compartment was riveted in place. By Station 7, the flight deck was installed, the instrument panel hanging loose, awaiting wiring. Harris moved with the bomber. He stood at each station with his stopwatch, clicking it every time a subassembly was completed. He wrote down numbers. He never spoke. Martin rode the line like a nervous father. He checked every rivet pattern against his red and blue circles. At Station 12, he stopped the line for 3 minutes because a rivet hole was off by a 64th of an inch. The worker apologized. Martin showed him how to use the alignment pin correctly. They didn't argue. At 8 p.m., the bomber reached Station 21, the wing center section. This was the heart of it, the part that had failed 3 months ago. The workers lifted the massive aluminum box into place. It slid into the fuselage like a drawer into a dresser. The rivet holes lined up perfectly. The fit was so tight you couldn't slip a hair between the pieces. Frank Clan was at Station 22. He didn't rivet anymore. He just watched. His job was to catch what everyone else missed. He stood there like a statue, his eyes moving over every seam, every bolt, every rivet head. He had a small ball-peen hammer in his hand. He tapped joints, listening for the sound of loose metal. He didn't find any. At 10:30 p.m., the bomber reached the final station. The 4 engines were waiting, already mounted on their nacelles. The workers rolled them into position on dollies. The electrical connections snapped into place like jumper cables. The fuel lines locked with quick connect fittings. Sorensen had insisted on those. They were from a tractor design of all things. The aviation engineers had screamed, but they worked. At 11:45 p.m., the bomber stood complete. It had moved a mile down the line, past 51 stations, past 200 workers. It gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a silver beast that hadn't existed 6 hours before. Martin walked around it twice. He checked the control surfaces. He checked the bomb bay doors. He checked the rivet patterns. He found 5 rivets that were slightly off spec. Not wrong, just not perfect. He looked at Sorensen. "Well?" Sorensen asked. "It'll fly," Martin said. He sounded surprised. "Will it fly right?" "It'll fly straight." They rolled it out of the factory at midnight. The night air was cold, the runway lights burning orange in the dark. The test pilot was already in the cockpit. He was a kid from Oklahoma named Jenkins. He'd been flying B-24s for 6 months, shipping them from factory to training base. He'd never flown one that was 6 hours old. Sorensen stood by the wing, smoking. Harris stood beside him, clicking his stopwatch. "This one took 5 hours, 43 minutes, Harris said. "Next one will be faster," Sorensen said. "The secretary arrives at 6 a.m. He wants to see the 4th bomber roll out." Sorensen looked at the sky. The stars were sharp and cold. "He'll see it." The engine started. The 4 propellers turned, became liquid discs of spinning metal. The bomber taxied away, moving into the darkness. Sorensen watched the taillights recede. He couldn't see Jenkins' face in the cockpit. He wondered if the kid was scared. The bomber lifted off at 12:18 a.m. It climbed slowly, heavily, but straight. The engine sounded smooth. The wings held. At 3,000 feet, it banked left, following the flight pattern. At 5,000, it disappeared into the clouds. Sorensen stood there until the sound faded. Then he turned back to the factory. The second bomber was already moving down the line. By 3 a.m., they had a rhythm. The workers had stopped thinking about each rivet. Their hands moved on their own. The nose section went in. The wings attached. The engines mounted. The line was learning. The workers were learning. Martin had stopped checking every rivet. He checked every 10th. He checked the critical joints. He let the rhythm carry him. At 5:30 a.m., the third bomber rolled out. This one took 5 hours, 12 minutes. They were getting faster. The workers were finding shortcuts that weren't shortcuts at all, just better ways to move. Betty, the woman who'd held the lunch pail so tight, found she could rivet twice as fast if she braced her elbow against the jig. The young man with the scar realized the wiring harness could be installed before the instrument panel, not after. He saved 8 minutes. At 5:45 a.m., the 4th bomber started down the line. The secretary's car was already visible on the access road, a dark speck kicking up dust in the dawn light. Sorensen stood by the first station. He was smoking his last cigarette. His hands were shaking from exhaustion and coffee. He watched the secretary's car approach. He watched the workers move. He watched the line. At 5:55 a.m., the 4th bomber reached Station 30. It was half built. The fuselage was complete, the wings were attached, but the engines weren't on yet. The bomb bay doors were still sitting in their cradle, waiting. The secretary walked onto the factory floor at 5:58 a.m. He wasn't alone. He had 2 generals with him and a civilian in a different dark suit. Not Harris. This one looked older, harder. He carried a briefcase too, but he didn't open it. The line kept moving. The workers didn't look up. They'd been told not to stop for anything. Not for the Secretary of War, not for the President himself. At 6 a.m., the 4th bomber reached the final station. The engines were waiting, the workers rolled them in, the connections snapped, the fuel lines locked. The secretary stood next to Sorensen. He didn't say anything, he just watched. At 6:02 a.m., the bomb bay doors were installed, 2 bolts each, 4 minutes. At 6:06 a.m., the final inspection began. Martin walked around the bomber. He checked the rivets, he checked the controls, he found 3 that were slightly off. He let them pass. They weren't critical. At 6:08 a.m., the bomber began moving toward the doors. It rolled on its own wheels now, heavy and real. The secretary looked at his watch. Then he looked at Sorensen. "You missed it," he said. "You were supposed to have one every 6 hours. This is 6 hours and 8 minutes." Sorensen looked at the bomber. Then he looked at the secretary. "The next one," he said, "will be under 6 hours." The secretary didn't answer. He walked out to the tarmac with the generals and the hard-looking civilian. They stood there as the 4th bomber was towed into position. The test pilot this time was a veteran, a major named Armstrong. He'd flown 30 missions over Germany. He'd been shot down twice. He knew what a good bomber felt like. He walked around the plane for 10 minutes. He checked the control surfaces, he checked the engines, he opened the bomb bay doors and closed them. He nodded. Then he climbed into the cockpit. The engine started. The prop spun. The secretary looked at the hard civilian. The civilian opened his briefcase. He pulled out a document. He handed it to the secretary. The bomber taxied away. The secretary was reading the document. He looked up at Sorensen. "This is a purchase order," he said, "for 8,000 bombers." Sorensen didn't move. "At 1 an hour," the secretary said, "that'll take you a year." "Less," Sorensen said. "The line learns fast." The bomber lifted off. It climbed smoothly, confidently. Armstrong put it through a series of turns, then brought it back around for a low pass over the runway. The wings were level, the engines were singing. The secretary signed the purchase order. He handed it to the hard civilian, who put it back in his briefcase. Then he turned to Sorensen. "One more thing," he said. "That colonel who gave you the ultimatum, he's been reassigned to the Pacific, infantry." Sorensen said nothing. He just watched the bomber fly. "Don't make me regret this," the secretary said. Then he walked back to his car. Sorensen stood there until the bomber disappeared into the morning sky. Then he walked back inside. The line was already moving again. The workers were already building the 5th bomber. He went to his office and sat down. He looked at the clock, 6:45 a.m. He looked at the calendar, March 19th, 1941. He looked at the telephone. It would start ringing soon. Washington would want updates. The British would want delivery schedules. The press would want interviews. But for now, he just sat. He listened to the sound of the line, the hiss of rivet guns, the clang of aluminum, the steady rhythm of a factory that had learned to build death at a mile an hour. Outside, the bombers were flying. Inside, the line never stopped.